What is the role of religion in our ever-changing world? From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Issues of Faith.
Hello everyone, welcome to Issues of Faith. I'm Ben Hall. Today, a closer examination of the parables of Jesus, a new book just out called Short Stories by Jesus, written by Amy Jill Levine of Vanderbilt Divinity School, examines the many parables of Jesus. And we're very happy to have Amy Jill Levine with us. Thank you for being here.
Delighted to be back.
So, how often is Jesus recorded in the Bible as speaking in parables?
Actually, most of the things that he says are not spoken in parables, but they're so memorable that the parables wind up sounding like the hallmark of his teaching. Ironically, the Gospel of John has no parables, so we have to go to Matthew, Mark, and Luke to get them.
Your goal with this book, what were you, when you sat down to write it, what was your goal?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that interest me. I teach in a divinity school, so I work with people who preach this material or will preach it. And I've heard from a number of students, as well as clergy, I'm so tired of the parables. If I have to do the Good Samaritan again, I can't manage it. Because they get boring, they're overdone. And a number of people, unfortunately, find them like as if they're children's stories because they were covered in Vacation Bible School or Sunday School. And they're not prepared to listen to parables as adults would hear them. So what I wanted to do was get that interest back, to try to get a sense of what the first audience, Jesus' first audience, would have taken away from those parables. People who didn't know he was going to die, people who didn't know that there would be a religion founded in his name, a bunch of Jews in the Galilee who were listening to a storyteller. What are they hearing? Because if we can hear that, we can get back the profundity and the punch of these stories.
Have we lost that? Have we kind of simplified these parables in such a way that we have lost what the people who heard them in that time would have taken away from them?
Yeah, I think very much we have. The parables have become sweet, they become platitudes, they make us feel comfortable. So we hear something like the parable of the Prodigal Son, and we're told God loves us no matter what sort of mistakes we make. And that is a splendid, splendid reading, and I don't want to take that away. But I don't think that's what people in the first century were hearing, because the parable is not about forgiveness and it's not about repentance. At least I don't think it is originally.
It's so much more complicated. And even the disciples at times had a difficult time understanding exactly what Jesus was trying to tell them, right?
Absolutely.
I sometimes, you read and you go, why don't you just say it?
Yeah.
But there's so much more going on here, right?
Right, that's exactly right. He treats the people with whom he's working, whether the crowds or the disciples or the Pharisees, whomever, he treats them with enough respect to say, work on this on your own. And that might be the best form of teaching. So he's not going to spoon feed them. What the parables generally do is tell us what we already know deep down inside but don't want to admit, about how best should we get along with our neighbors, about how best should we function in an economic world, about how should we understand politics or parenthood. But if we come up with the answers on our own using those parables as prompts, we're much more likely to internalize the message and then be able to act on it.
And they do take on perhaps different meanings for different people. If you are a poor person, you may interpret this differently than if you're a wealthy person.
Absolutely.
And that's just a basic thing. Is that part of their brilliance? Is that part of their design?
I think any story can be interpreted in multiple ways. And we see that with movie critics. Oh, this was fabulous, now it was dreadful. So as soon as Jesus tells the parable, it then blossoms into multiple interpretations. And we've seen that through the centuries. We've got 2,000 years worth of interpretation of these things. There are a number of parables that begin, there was a rich man who. And generally when we have parables that begin, there was a rich man who, it's not going to be good news for the rich man. Right? So if I'm a poor person and I hear that, I might have a different takeaway than if I'm a rich person and I hear that, sure.
So was that standard operating procedure back in that time, to talk in stories, to use parables, or was that unusual? Was Jesus doing something that was very, very different? And then at the same time, we have to remember there wasn't a reporter there transcribing every word.
Right.
I mean, the Gospels were written years later. So these things were passed on over years before they were finally put down. So I mean, that fascinates me too. But was that standard operating procedure in the time to speak in stories and kind of inform people in that way?
Yeah, very much so. And here's a point where being historically oriented helps. Because today when we hear parables, we think they're just simple stories or moral tales. But Jews understood from the scriptures of Israel, the Christian Old Testament, what the synagogue would call the Tanakh, there are lots of parables there. And parables were designed to indict. If a parable is told directly to you, run away because you're about to be indicted. They're designed to shake up the status quo, to get us to see the world otherwise. So the general reaction to a parable is, I don't think that I like that, because it's telling me I should be a better person than I am, or it's telling me that my world can be even better, but I have to work at it. So Jesus is tapping into a genre already recognized by people at the time.
And again, what you're trying to do in this book is take us back to that time and how they would have understood it. And so what is one, and I'll even ask for another later, but what is a parable that is interpreted in a way now, and you mentioned the prodigal son, that may have been looked at entirely differently back then, and kind of illuminate us on that?
Yeah. Even if we look at titles, that gives us a sense of how we have interpreted these parables. The prodigal son, which is only in the Gospel of Luke chapter 15, starts out, there was a man who had 2 sons, which means that the original audience is not hearing the story about just Junior, the prodigal. They're actually hearing the story about a man who had 2 sons. But as soon as Jesus begins the parable with that opening line, every Jew knows the plot line because they know the scriptures of Israel, where there are lots of men who have 2 sons. Adam has 2 sons, Cain and Abel. Abraham has 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. And every Jew knows, go with the younger son. Right? The older son is going to wind up to be a murderer or violent or not terribly bright. Go with the younger son. The thing about parables is they never quite go the way you think they're going to go, because they shake up our worldview. And what do we find with Junior? He's the younger son, but we do not want to identify with him. And what happens toward the end, toward the middle of the parable, is the prodigal comes home, and if viewers have not read this, go read it. Right? You can pick up a Bible in any hotel; they're available. And we hear about how the prodigal has come home and Dad has welcomed him, and there's a big feast and all that. And first century Jews are thinking, wait a minute, there were 2 sons. What about the other one? And we're told that the older brother is out in the field and he hears the sound of music and dancing. The Greek is actually choir and symphony, right? And he calls the slave and says, what's happened? And the slave says, you know, Junior's come back and Dad killed the fatted calf. What we have here is a story where the older brother was overlooked. He wasn't counted. They had enough time to call the band and the caterer, and nobody called Senior. And that's where that first century Jewish audience is looking. What about that older son? What happened to him? If we call it the parable of the prodigal, we're probably miscuing how that original audience would have heard it. They're thinking about that lost older son whom Dad didn't count. And is it too late for Dad to bring him back in?
So our very title today skews it.
Absolutely.
That is interesting. And what's another one? I mean, that's fascinating. So that is how they would have seen it. They would have seen, we should have been looking at the older son, whereas we're all focused on the prodigal son and the father. What's another example? The book is fascinating. It's really interesting. You get into about a dozen parables, and each chapter in the book, you go through a parable. It gets its own chapter, which is good. What's another parable that maybe is looked at differently today than was back then?
Yeah, the Good Samaritan might be, along with the prodigal, probably the most famous of Jesus' parables. And the way it's often read today is the Samaritan is the oppressed minority group, or the Samaritan is the marginalized person. And we're supposed to read the parable to say, those people are nice too, right? Or we simply talk about Good Samaritan as if it's a perfectly normal way of referring to somebody. But just take that into a modern, he's a good Mexican. He's a good Muslim. I mean, that's today a somewhat offensive term, because it's presuming that all the rest of them, you know, not so much. If we look at the Samaritan as the oppressed minority group, we're miscuing the first century. Samaritans are not the oppressed minority group. they're the enemy. And in case we missed it, because we missed that lecture in our Introduction to New Testament course, Luke, the writer, tells us that, because Luke is really, really smart. In Luke chapter 9, which is one chapter before our parable, Jesus and his followers are going from Galilee up in the north to Jerusalem down in the south. This is Jesus on the journey. And they stop off in a Samaritan village, and Jesus is looking for hospitality. And the Samaritans refuse him hospitality because his face is set toward Jerusalem. At this point, two of the apostles, James and John, in their apostolic best, say to Jesus, "Lord, shall we call down fire from heaven and destroy this village?" And Jesus has to respond, bombing a village is not a good response to lack of hospitality. This is not an issue of minority group. This is an issue of enemy. So when we hear the parable of the Good Samaritan, we might be thinking, we're the guy in the ditch, and we're wondering, who's going to rescue me? And we may well think, I'd rather die than acknowledge that somebody from this group, this enemy group, could possibly be the one to save my life. And that's a much harder lesson to learn than, oh, they're nice too.
Right, and we all need to be nice.
Yeah.
There is that greater message. What about the fact that these were written many years after they were told? Was Jesus is certainly the primary author. He spoke them first. Is there any sense that they would have been changed in any way, or that the passage of time from the time they were said until the time they were written down and put into the Bible, what is the impact of that time?
It's a wonderful question for which we have not very good answers, because we don't have access to whatever oral tradition there is. All we have is what's recorded in the gospel. And I don't want to take that away. I mean, that's the material on which the church rests. What historians can attempt to do is to figure out, does the frame for this parable suggest the agenda of the evangelist? I think Jesus told parables more than once. He's a good storyteller, and any good storyteller is going to go from place to place. And if the parable worked with group A, it's probably going to work with group B. So as soon as the gospel writers say, oh, this is the audience, they've already contextualized the parable in a way that I think narrows its possible meaning. Mm-hmm. Stories, folk tales, fairy tales, moral stories, say like Aesop's fables, those tend to remain fairly consistent over time, and we know that from oral storytelling cultures today. You can even see that with something like Cinderella or the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. The words may change, but the basic plot line is going to remain pretty secure. So I have a feeling that although Jesus spoke in Aramaic and the New Testament is written in Greek, and most of us are reading it in English, and Jesus lived in the early part of the first century, and the Gospels are written in the latter part of the first century, I think for the most part the parables are fairly consistent with what actually came forth from Jesus' lips.
And that is true with fables and that kind of thing. It does, maybe a couple of words change, but the basic story does stay the same, even though they're told generation after generation. That's interesting. All right, we're going to take a break. We'll come back. We'll talk more about this. Short Stories by Jesus, a new book by Amy Jill Levine. Be back right after this.